And let me share the screen with you. Okay, so today we'll talk about production theory. And this is sort of the theory of the classic competitive firm who's assumed to be a profit maximizer. All right. Um, so the firm produces one output, uh, which we denote by Y, its quantity. And the theory can easily be extended to multi-product firms, right, without much trouble. But let's start by thinking of a single product firm. And the firm uses N different inputs, right? So that could be labor, capital, energy, raw materials, etc. So X is the vector of inputs, and it contains quantities of each of the N inputs, X1 through Xn. Now, each firm will have some input-output relationship, right, which is a description of its technology. So this, if we want to construct in the real world this input-output relationship, we have to talk to the firm's engineers and its technical people who will be able to tell us, if there are 100 man hours and 10 lakh rupees worth of capital and so much raw material, etc., how much output will be produced at the end of the day. Yeah. So all of that is mathematically captured in this production function F, right? F gives us for any vector of inputs, what is the firm's output? And there are some natural assumptions we want to place on F. So we want to say that, F is continuous. It's strictly increasing in the inputs. If you have more inputs, you can't end up producing less. If anything, you'll produce more. And lastly, we want to assume that F is quasi-concave, just like our utility function will assume our production function to be quasi-concave. And that again seems like a natural assumption. So for example, if you have only workers and they have nothing to work with, no tools, no equipment, no machines, then they'll be not very productive. On the other hand, if you have lots of high-tech machines, but very few workers to operate those machines, then again, your output will be low. And if you create some sort of convex combination of these input vectors, right, you create, you kind of settle somewhere in the middle, have some machines and some workers, then the firm is going to be more productive. So that's the idea. Just like diversity of tastes, some sort of notion of diversity is kind of natural here. So our production function is therefore quasi-concave, and sometimes we may want to assume strictly quasi-concave, right? That'll be a stronger assumption. And another natural assumption is that if you don't use any inputs whatsoever, then your output is equal to zero. Let me say the obvious also that unlike in choice theory or consumer theory, the absolute value of the production function is meaningful, and because it's something physically measurable, right? With so many workers and so much capital, how many cars can a car company produce? We can measure the number of cars, right? So the value that the production function takes is objective and measurable. And so unlike utility functions, we cannot willy-nilly take some sort of monotonic transformation and say, that's also a valid production function. We can't do that. Now, we can define an isoquant, which will be the exact analog of an indifference curve, right? An isoquant is a set of input vectors which have the property that all of them produce the same level of output Y, right? And of course, there will be different isoquants for different levels, right? Each isoquant refers to, there's a reference point for each isoquant, which is a particular output level. But once you fix an output level Y, you can find several different input vectors which can produce that output level, right? So as we know that, in the same production can be carried out in many different ways. You can adopt more labor-intensive methods or more capital-intensive methods. Um, um, if you take the textile industry, for example, traditionally textiles were, garments and cloth was made with much more labor input. Yes. Um, and with the industrial revolution, more capital intensive, more machine intensive, more automated factory methods were discovered. So we still have things like handicrafts, like um, textiles, which are done by people and not sort of big machines on the assembly line. But you can also go towards more industrial methods. Um, Now, just as in utility theory or choice theory, the monotonicity and quasi-concavity of F implies that isoquants are convex to the origin, and higher isoquants represent higher output levels, and that's just the straightforward analog of what we saw in utility theory. So there's not much to discuss there. Um, One important notion related to production functions is the notion of returns to scale. Okay, and we can make three classifications about the returns to scale. So a production function will be said to display constant returns to scale, or CRS, if this relationship holds for all input vectors. This relationship says that if you scale up all inputs by some factor lambda, suppose lambda equal to 2. So that means if you double all the inputs, then your output is going to double. If that feature is true for some production process, then that production function will have constant returns to scale, right? Everything is kind of a replica of larger or smaller levels of production. Now, some other production functions may display a different property, which is decreasing returns to scale, which says that if you, for example, double all the inputs, your output less than doubles. If that's true everywhere on the production function, then we have decreasing returns to scale. And increasing returns to scale is the third case, where if you double output, if your output more than doubles, say trebles or quadruples, then we have increasing returns to scale. Now, mathematically, these are sort of more general definitions. Yes. A particular class of production functions are homogeneous production functions. So if a production function has this property, that if you multiply all the inputs by some factor lambda, lambda is a positive number, then your output goes up by the factor lambda to the power k. If this is true everywhere, k is a constant, right? If this is true everywhere, then this is a production function which is homogeneous of degree k, right? And you can immediately link the value of k to these definitions that we laid out, right? CRS, DRS, IRS. CRS means k equal to 1. DRS means k is less than 1. And increasing returns to scale means k is greater than 1. Okay? So these are definitions, but they're useful definitions. So let's see a little bit more where they come in. Meanwhile, some more definitions. We have already talked about what is a perfectly competitive market. A perfectly competitive market, the crux of it is price-taking behavior, that buyers and sellers are so small that each acts as a price taker. Each takes the market price as given and assumes that their quantity decisions, how much to buy, how much to sell, will not affect that market price, right? In some problems, in your problem set or exams, you will see problems where I say that there is a single seller, there's a single buyer, but each acts like a price taker, right? Now that may seem a little odd, but it's not, for analytical purposes, we can assume that, in a particular exercise. Perfect competition boils down to price-taking behavior, right? Not the number per se, but as long as each agent behaves in a price-taking manner, we will have perfect competition, right? Um, Now, so let's focus on a perfectly competitive firm. That means the firm participates in input and output markets, all of which have perfect competition. So the firm acts as a price taker in both the input and the output markets. That's going to be our assumption. So that means that the firm takes the going market price of output P and the going input price vector W, right? W with goes from W1 to Wn. The firm takes all these prices as given from the respective markets, right? And just chooses quantities, meaning how much of each input to purchase and use and how much output to produce. So those are the choice variables for the firm. So now the firm's profit maximization problem boils down to this simple form, right? This is the profit expression. Price times quantity of output is the revenue of the firm. From that, you're subtracting the product of these two vectors. This is the vector product, mind you, right? It's the input price vector times the input use vector. So that product is basically summation of Wi xi, I going from 1 to n. So that's the total cost of the firm, right? So you're
Excuse me, sir.
yes.
Sir, I think there is some typo. P should be output price and W should
Sorry,
be.
yeah, P is output price. That's right. Yeah. Um, so make that correction. So this is the profit of the firm, revenue minus cost. Um, and the one constraint is that the firm has to honor the production function, the condition of technology. The firm cannot, make output from fantasy, right? It has to come out of the technology that it has as captured in the production function, right? Um, in principle, the firm can throw away some of the output it has produced, but of course, it will never be optimal to do that. So this inequality constraint can very quickly be converted to equality, y equal to fx, and that does not change the solution to this problem. So if we replace the equality constraint, we can do a substitution, right? We can, instead of y, we can write f of x, and then this problem reduces to this form where you're choosing the input vector, yes? And the moment the firm chooses its input vector, its output is automatically determined by the production function. Now, one approach to this problem, yes?
Is there any difference between y and f of x, like technically?
Y is defined to be f of f. F of x is tells you how much y you get if you for every input vector, right? So they're the same thing.
So I did not understand the constraint part. Like,
Well, I can, okay, depends on how I define y, right? You can, to explain the inequality, let's be precise. Fx is how much output will be produced if you choose the input vector x. Y is how much output you sell, right? In principle, you can sell less than you produce and store away or throw away the rest, in principle. Now, it'll of course be suboptimal and silly to do so. So very quickly, we can forget about this distinction about how much has been produced and how much has been sold. We can put the two equal to each other.
okay, okay.
Okay, so here's a kind of two-step approach to try and solve this problem. And you will quickly see why there are some benefits to trying to solve the profit maximization problem of the firm in two successive steps. Okay, but let me describe the two-step approach. Of course, part of profit maximization is cost minimization. So here's what the firm can do. The firm can say, okay, let me fix some output target or sales target Y. Let's say we want to produce and sell 1,000 cars in a year, let's say, right? What is the, how should I produce those cars so that my cost is minimized, right? So minimize the overall cost of production of 1,000 cars with the constraint that you don't want to fall short of the target of 1,000 cars, right? Now, you can solve that problem, and you can solve that problem for every possible conceivable output target, right? You solve the problem for one value of y, then you solve for another value of y, and in principle, you can solve for all possible values of y. And for each value of y, you find a minimum cost given market conditions and market prices. And then when you put it all together, you get what is called the cost function, right? The cost function in particular is a function of y, the output level, right? And the cost function gives you for each output level, what's the least costly way of producing it. So that's the first step of this two-step approach. You solve your cost minimization problem and construct your cost function. The cost function for this problem is the value function of this problem, really, yeah, in the more general terminology. All right, so once we have found the cost function, then as a second step, we can solve profit maximization only with respect to output by maximizing this function. This is a simple, unconstrained, one variable optimization problem. Yes, so let's break it up in this fashion. Now, if we do break it up in this fashion, then if you look at the first step, there's absolutely nothing new about that first step, right? It is something that we have already studied, and that's one of the advantages of doing so. We have already studied in consumer theory or choice theory. How did it show up in choice theory?
Expenditure minimization.
That's right. This is exactly like expenditure minimization. So the cost function is nothing but our previous friend expenditure function, just given a different name. Mathematically, it's the same object, isn't it? It's just that, instead of a household, we're talking of a firm. What we were previously calling consumer goods, we are now calling inputs, and so on and so forth, right? Now, if you look at this problem has some choice functions, some values of x, which will be optimal, right? So these are called the conditional input demand functions, right? So how much of each input the firm will want to use for cost minimization purposes depends, of course, on the input prices, but also on the output target. Yes. You change the output target, these demands will change. So that's why these are called conditional input demand functions. And again, since this exercise is exactly like the dual of the consumer's problem, right, the expenditure minimization problem, the analog of these conditional input demand functions are the Hicksian demand functions. They're nothing, again, they're nothing but Hicksian demand functions by another name. So in particular, they will be downward sloping, for example, with respect to the input prices. If you fix an output target and the price of one input goes up, then the conditional demand for that input has to go down. We already saw that through, that Hicksian demand functions are downward sloping. So are these. Okay, now let's establish a relationship between the shape or curvature of our production functions and the shape of the cost function, right? There's a very close link, as you might imagine. So let's restrict attention to production functions which are homogeneous production functions, right? Let me just get my phone so that I can keep track of the time. Okay, so let's look at the class of homogeneous production functions of degree k. There's this relationship between the cost between the degree of homogeneity. This is how the cost function depends on the degree of homogeneity. It's kind of inversely related to that, right? So the cost function is some constant. The constant happens to be the cost of producing 1 unit of output, right? But regardless, it's a constant. It's a constant times y to the power 1 over the degree of homogeneity, 1 over k, right? For example, if we have a decreasing returns technology, so k is less than 1, then that means that the cost function will be convex. 1 over k is a number bigger than 1, right? On the other hand, if you have an increasing returns technology, then k is larger than 1, which means that our cost function is going to be concave, right? So k greater than 1 means our production function is convex, right? You can easily check that. So if you have convex production functions, you have concave cost functions, and vice versa. If you have concave production functions, decreasing returns to scale technology, then you have convex cost functions. And the borderline case where you have CRS, there your cost function is going to be linear, k equal to 1, right? In that case, cost function is something times y. So here's a proof. Let me very quickly go through it. So this is, if we start from the first line, that's just definition, right? Cost function is given by the minimized value of total input cost subject to fx equals y, production target being met. Now we can, in the next 2 steps, we are doing a little bit of manipulation with these expressions. All right. In the second line, I can bring the y to the other side. It becomes 1 minus y. And so we have written it as y to the power minus 1, right? And what adjustment have I done to the objective function that is being minimized? I've multiplied it by this factor. I multiplied the x vector by this scalar y to the power minus 1 over k. And I've multiplied it, the whole thing, by that same scalar, right? So the minimized value of this will be y to the power 1 over k times the minimized value of just simply w times x, right? I've just multiplied by a number and divided by that same number, and those would cancel out. So there's an equivalence between the minimized value of wx and y to the power 1 over k times the minimized value of this, right? So I have done these little manipulations to the constraint and the objective function, which maintain an equivalence between the first line and the second line. Yeah. Now I can work on that a little more. So let's come to the third line. Since the production function is homogeneous of degree k, what that means is that if I multiply the argument by some number, then I can take that number outside and it gets raised to the power k, right? Conversely, if I have some number sitting outside as a coefficient, if I want to take it inside the function, then I'll have to raise it to the power 1 over k, right? These are just the valid converse operations. If I pull out a scalar from inside, I have to raise it to the power k. If I pull in a scalar from outside, I have to raise it to the power 1 over k, right? So that's what I've done here, from going from step 1, step 2 to step 3, right? So this is valid. This is a valid operation, a valid way of expressing the constraint. And this remains as it was. So now let's just define z as a new vector, which is given by x times this factor, y to the power minus 1 over k, right? If I multiply the vector x by this scalar, that's what I'm defining to be z, right? So from the third line, we can go to the fourth line. Our cost function is y to the power 1 over k times the minimized value of WZ with the constraint that f of z has to equal 1, right? So if you forget about this coefficient and if you just look at this, this is basically the answer to the cost minimization problem with an output target, not of some general y, but an output target of exactly one unit of output has to be produced, right? So whatever be the solution to this, it is basically the value of the cost function at output level 1, right? So that's what takes us to the last line and the result that we were trying to prove, that our cost function is the minimized cost at output level 1 times this factor, y raised to the power 1 over k. And we can reproduce the same kind of proof for the other parts of the claim, that, this relationship holds for cost functions. It also holds for conditional input demand functions, right? So the proof is exactly similar. All right. So bottom line, curvature of the production function and curvature of the cost function have this kind of inverse relationship. If one is concave, the other is convex. If one is convex, the other is concave. And if one is linear, the other is linear too.
So,
yes.
So in the previous slide, you mentioned that the cost minimization problem is dual to the consumer problem.
Right.
So what does dual mean?
I explained it before, right? That came up in a previous lecture.
Okay, I missed that. Okay, so okay.
Can somebody explain what the dual of an optimization problem is?
So if we are like maximizing the objective function and keeping the subject to the constraint, the dual would be to minimize the constraint while we subject it to the original objective function. That is the duality of it.
Excellent. So so if anybody is rusty on that, just go back and look at the slides in consumer theory and the lecture videos. All right. Okay, so now, as I said, we are looking at the sort of two-step approach to the firm's profit maximization problem, right? So we have solved the first stage, as it were, or we know how to solve the first stage, which is cost minimization exercise. So suppose we have done that, and we have constructed the cost function. So now the second stage problem is very, very simple. It's an unconstrained one variable optimization. It's as simple as it gets, right? We are trying to maximize this. P times Y minus cost of Y, all right? So provided there's an interior solution, the first order condition will be derivative of this equal to 0. So that means you'll have a P from here, and you will have the derivative of the cost function, del C del Y, which can be called marginal cost, right? So P minus marginal cost equals 0. So price equals marginal cost is the optimizing principle, right? So this is what a profit maximizing firm does. It carries production and sales up to the point where the given market price equals the firm's marginal cost. And again, the intuition is it should be something that you can recite in your sleep. If the firm is producing at a level where price is greater than marginal cost, so the price of each car is 10 lakhs, but the marginal cost of producing one car is 8 lakhs. That means if the firm produces another extra car, it can make 2 lakhs of profits. So it should expand production. On the other hand, if it's sitting at a production level where the price is 10 lakhs a car, but the marginal cost is 15 lakhs, that means the firm is overproducing. That means the last car they have sold brought them a loss of 5 lakhs, right? And so they should, going forward, they should cut back on production. They should produce less because they can eliminate some losses in the process, right? Now, second order conditions are important, we know, right? So when we are doing this simple maximization, we also have to make sure that the second derivative of this expression is negative. Now, if you differentiate it twice, the first term, the derivative of the first term disappears, right? Because it's linear. So when you differentiate twice, that's 0. And you have del square C del y squared coming from minus del square C del y squared, right? So that means the derivative of marginal cost has to be positive. Yes. So that's what we have here. So marginal cost should be increasing at the optimum output level, right? This is, of course, measured not at some arbitrary point, but at y star, whatever is being claimed as the firm's optimal production level. And it is given by the point where price and marginal costs are equal. At that point, our second order condition requires that marginal cost should be increasing. Yes. Now, if you have a decreasing returns to scale technology, we already proved, at least for homogeneous functions, that if k is less than 1, then we have convex marginal cost. That means marginal cost is increasing everywhere. At every value of y, marginal cost is increasing. So for DRS technology, the second order condition will be automatically satisfied, right? For constant returns technology, we are in that kind of borderline case, right? Where second order condition just about is barely being satisfied. But what if our technology is increasing returns? K is greater than 1. Then our cost function is concave, which means marginal cost is falling everywhere, right? For every level of output. So there's no way you can satisfy the second order condition. So for increasing returns technologies, we have a problem. You can find some output level where price and marginal costs are equal, but it won't be the optimal output level because second order condition can't be satisfied over there. So what's going on really? What's going on is not very hard to understand. So take the case of DRS, right? This is quantity. This is price and cost. Let's draw the marginal cost curve. As we just proved, for DRS, marginal cost is increasing, right? And let's take some market price. Let's say this is the market price, all right? So if I apply the price equals marginal cost principle, then I get this point. This is the candidate for the optimum output level. Let's call it provisionally the optimal output level, right? It may or may not truly be the optimal output level. But if the firm chooses Q star, what is its profit? Its profit is this area, right? Intuitively, if you approximate the continuum by many small discrete units, for the first unit, the firm's marginal cost is this. That means that's the cost of producing the first unit. But if it sells the first unit on the market, it gets much more. And that vertical gap is the profit coming from the first unit. Now, if the firm produces a second unit, let's say a second car, then its cost is a little higher of producing the second car, but still it's less than the market price. So when it goes out and sells the second car, it keeps a margin. It's not as big a margin as the first car, but it's still a profit margin. So as it goes from the first to the second to the third car, it's making extra profits, additional profits on each marginal car, except that this extra profit is getting less and less until it hits Q star, where the marginal car, the marginal unit being produced, neither fetches a profit nor a loss, right? So at that point, all profit opportunities have been exhausted. And if the firm makes a mistake and goes beyond Q star, then on that extra production, that extra car that it makes, it only earns P from the market, but the cost of production is higher than that. So this difference here is negative profit, it's loss, right? So the firm doesn't want to venture into territory where the marginal units will fetch losses. So that's why it stops at Q star. So here Q star in this picture with DRS, Q star is indeed the optimum production level, right? But if you draw the similar picture for increasing returns, and here our marginal cost curve is downward sloping. Well, indeed, there's a point where price and marginal cost are equal. But this point, instead of maximizing profits, actually minimizes profits, right? And you can see that very easily in the picture, because again, if you consider a first unit, a second unit, a third unit, sort of small successive increments, on the first unit, the price was this much, but the cost of producing that first unit was higher than the price, yes? So this vertical distance is not a profit, it's a loss coming from making and selling the first unit. And then if you move on to the second unit, similarly, there will be a loss there. And for the third unit, there's a loss. So if you produce up to Q star, this green region is really not a profit, it's a loss, or it's a negative profit. So you've ended up maximizing losses rather than maximizing profits. Yes. So this is for DRS technology. So what is the true optimum in this case? What is the truly optimum value of Q?
So,
Yes.
so isn't there potential for earning infinite profit in the
That's
case
right.
of?
So that's why I was asking the question, right? So here, if you go beyond Q star, you actually start accumulating profits on those additional units. Then these vertical distances, these gaps, are positive gaps between price and cost. And so once the firm moves beyond Q star, it starts accumulating profits. Yes. And potentially this area is of infinite size, whereas this is of finite size. And so the firm should really, it seems, the firm should produce infinity as an amount. Now, that is a kind of a conundrum, right? What happens if there are increasing returns technology? What are examples of increasing returns technology, right? Things which, I don't know, things which have high setup costs, for example, like, producing electricity, setting up a railway, developing a medicine, a pharmaceutical drug. All of these have, before you start producing, you have to spend a lot of money as fixed costs, in R&D, in setting up infrastructure, like, laying down the railway lines or creating the transmission grid and so on. And then once you start producing and, expand in volume, then the additional cost of supplying more customers is often very little. Yes. So if you think of this is IRS, increasing returns technology, right? So what we're saying is that, in those kinds of products or industries, price-taking firms will end up wanting to produce infinite amounts. But that doesn't make any sense, does it? Right? So what gives? How can we reconcile this seemingly bizarre optimal choice of the firms with increasing returns to scale technologies? You get my question? So we can think of products, we can think of industries where increasing returns to scale would be a feature, at least for a very large range of output, right? I gave you examples: railways, utilities, pharmaceutical products which require R&D.
Sir, is it similar to economies of scale?
Yes, I mean, that's just a term, right? I mean, you can say increasing returns involves economies of scale, right? But that's just using another term to describe the same technological feature. What I'm asking is, our analysis shows that if that technological feature is present, whatever you want to call it, increasing returns, economies of scale, then each firm, it seems, should optimally produce infinite amounts. But in the real world, they don't produce infinite amounts, or it doesn't make sense to produce infinite amounts. So how do we make our theory and the observation that finite amounts are produced? How do we make these two match?
So I will take a hunch.
Yeah.
Walter Roy example. Can it be?
Say that again.
Walter Roy.
One.
No, Walter Roy. Walter Roy, the amusement park example. That
Walter Roy is a name of an economist. You have to tell me the concept, the idea, right? Walter Roy.
So
Walter Roy say, how did Walter Roy reconcile, right? I mean,
so could the resource constraint play a role?
okay, so you could say that, well, the railways should keep laying railway lines and send railway lines to every doorstep till they run out of steel. But they don't do even that.
So demand also plays a role.
Yeah.
There will be, in long run, sir, there will be entry of the firms and price will converge to zero.
Sir, can they be natural monopolies?
Yeah. Let me come to that last point, but price will converge to zero. But once again, Nishchal, you said that, but railway tickets and electricity bills are not zero in the real world, right? So prices haven't converged to zero. So if that's what our theory tells us, it's immediately contradicted by what we see. Somebody was saying something, Sushant?
Sir, if the companies will continue to produce more and more, it will lead to the exploitation of nature.
It may lead to the next exploitation of nature. I'm not saying whether the outcome is good or bad. I'm just saying that, our theory says that they'll want to produce infinite amounts. And that may be terrible, but that's not the question. The question is, why don't we see them produce infinite amounts in these kinds of industries, railways, utilities, electricity, and so on?
So because the market demand
Maybe
is not...
it's the question of imperfect competition.
Think about these examples: railways, electricity companies, pharmaceutical drugs.
So the objective is not to maximize profit. That's why.
Well,
so because of lack of resources.
Okay, Indian railways
there may be physical constraints to it.
They all have 2 or 3 participants or a small number of participants because the cost of entry is really high.
Yeah.
Diseconomies of scale.
These industries are natural monopolies where you do not have a large number of participants, so they can change the price.
They don't have large number of participants exactly, but you can go even further. Typically, how many participants do you see in these kinds of markets?
Only one.
Only one. You see
government is
monopolies,
there.
right? You see monopolies. So broad idea is, so the point is that increasing returns to scale, this feature of the technology, and perfectly competitive behavior just does not go together. If a product or an industry has this kind of technology, then it will one way or another devolve into something like a monopoly, right? You cannot have perfect competition. The logic of perfect competition and the logic of producing under these conditions clash with each other, right? So the perfectly competitive model is extremely, in fact, completely unsuitable to products and markets where increasing returns is a feature or economies of scale is a feature. Economies of scale up to a large point, right? Sometimes you'll have production processes where you can have economies of scale up to a certain amount, and then these economies of scale start setting in, right? Those won't be homogeneous production functions, but it's possible to have such production functions. The cost function then will be convex for a small range, and then it'll turn concave and marginal cost will come coming down and so on. But if there's increasing returns for a very long range of output, as for railways and electricity production, then we will not end up with perfect competition. And often, if the government doesn't regulate it or create a license or a permit to produce, natural competition will lead to a monopoly. Essentially, a large firm has an advantage over small rivals in this market because a large firm has lower costs compared to small firms. So they can price out or undercut the small firms and capture all the consumers. Yes. And so these kinds of markets naturally become monopolies. So they're called natural monopolies. In some cases, they're monopolies by government regulation. So my third example, which is the, pharmaceutical products which require a great deal of R&D, there are patents, right? So a firm comes up with such a product and it will have a protected monopolized market due to the patent, which lasts typically 20 years or some very long period. So that's an artificial monopoly, but again, it's created in a situation where increasing returns prevails. All right. What about the intermediate case, constant returns? So let's quickly look at that. So when you have constant returns, that means your marginal cost is flat. It's a flat line. This marginal cost. Now, there are three possible cases, right? Your price could be strictly below the marginal cost. In which case, what is the optimal output level?
Zero production.
Zero, right?
Zero.
Even the first unit will generate losses, and you keep producing more, you keep generating more and more losses. So optimal, you have a corner solution, optimum output is zero. If price was above, so P1, P2 is above marginal cost, strictly above, then what is optimum?
Infinite.
Infinite,
Anything.
right? Now, what if price is exactly equal to marginal cost? Then the optimal output level is anything, right? If P2 is higher, you don't, an optimum output level does not exist, right? But if P3 is equal to MC, anything is an optimum output level. So if we have constant marginal cost, constant returns to scale, can we also have perfect competition? Well, the answer is yes, but how much each firm will produce has to be determined, after looking at the market conditions, right? So here, essentially what happens is that in such industries, when you have constant returns to scale, the price, eventually the market clearing price will have to drop to the level of the marginal cost of each firm. Yes. And only then can you have a match between demand and supply. If price is any less, there will be zero supply. If price is any more, there will be infinite supply. So this will be the market clearing price. Okay.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Sir, how will the marginal cost behave in terms of, say, oligopolies such as the airline market where we have only two major players? So how will the marginal cost behave then?
First of all, marginal cost is independent of market structure. Marginal cost is something more fundamental. What is marginal cost? Marginal cost is coming from the technology of how you can produce the good, right? Now, whether there's only one company, one firm which sells this good, or 10 or 1,000, does not change the engineering facts on the ground, right? The technology of producing cars is the same, whether the car market has been monopolized or whether it's captured by a few powerful firms or whether there are, lots and lots of car companies. Yes. So if a market suddenly goes from a very competitive one to an oligopoly, like sometimes happens, right? Our airline industry, for example, is shrinking. In particular, the telecom industry, we had 8, 10 providers like Tata, Indicom, and Idea, and so on. They've all folded up, right? So now it's 3, and very soon, some people say it'll be 2, Jio and Airtel. So that industry has gone much more in the oligopoly/monopoly direction, but that doesn't mean its production functions have changed and the cost functions have changed. They are the same, right?
All right, sir. I was just asking because, as you mentioned, we cannot have like increasing returns to scale in a perfect competition. So is there something which categorizes oligopolies as well? That was my idea behind asking.
Okay, so your question is that, can we have some sort of oligopoly with increasing returns to scale?
Sort of, so yeah.
Let's say a duopoly. Well, it depends on how much increasing returns to scale you have. If you have increasing returns to scale all through, from zero output level to all the way, every time you expand your production level, your costs come down, then even duopoly is not possible, right? Because again, one of the two firms which gets bigger will always have a pricing edge over the other firm and can drive it out. Yeah.
Right, sir. Thank you.
So, sir, we can say that perfect competition is possible only in CRS, like in DRS, and in some cases in CRS, right?
That's right. That's right.
Okay, sir. Okay.
But it's not possible in IRS. Well put. I took more words to say the same thing. Okay, so now let's forget now for the two-step approach. Let's go to the more direct approach, right? So let's write down the profit maximization form problem in this way, where we have replaced the constraint y equals fx into the objective function, right? So now the problem has been formulated directly in one step as a problem of choosing an optimal input vector, right? Choose x to solve this, maximize your profits. And the moment you choose x from the production function, you know how much output will be produced. So that is not that is automatically determined. Now, if there's an interior solution, there's a simple first order condition to this formulation of the problem, right? Which is price times marginal product of every input equals the price of that input, right? This can be called marginal revenue product of input I. So that is equated to price of input I. And again, the logic is exactly the same. You keep increasing your labor till the last worker you have hired is adding exactly as much to the company's output or value as the salary you have to pay to that last worker, right? At that point, you stop. You don't hire any more people. Now, this is the first order condition, but then, second order conditions have to be satisfied. And we have previously talked about, in an unconstrained problem, what is the second order condition? If it's a multivariate problem, well, the Hessian matrix of the objective function has to be negative semi-definite. Yes. What is a Hessian matrix? Hessian matrix is the matrix of the second derivatives of our profit function. Now, if you look at the profit function, all the second derivatives of the profits are nothing but the second derivatives of f, right? Because the other part is linear. So if we differentiate twice, first with, if you differentiate twice, that'll go away. So first of all, let's nail some definitions. You look at the choice functions of this problem, right? They are the input demand functions or the unconditional input demand functions, right? To be distinguished from the conditional input demand functions that we got when we were following the two-step way of solving the problem, right? Unconditional because it's not conditional on the output level. The output level here is itself endogenous. That's part of the choice. So these are our input demand functions, unconditional, or the usual input demand functions. And once you have found all the optimal inputs, if you plug it into the production function, you get the optimal output level, and that is the supply function of the firm, right? So this is the usual supply function that we talk about. And as in consumer theory, choice theory, we want to know whether our theory has any testable implications. Can we say something about, for example, the shape of the supply function? Can we state something like a law of supply that, if prices go up, then supply has to increase? Is that a sort of statement logically warranted? Yeah. So it turns out we can indeed make such a statement from the second order conditions, exploiting the second order conditions. So, so here are some properties of the profit function, and then I'll get to the testable implication. These properties are fairly simple, right? Profit functions have to be increasing in the output price. Because even if the output price goes up, even if you don't change any of your decisions, you make more profits, right? You can continue producing the same amount using the same inputs, you make more money. And on top of that, if you re-optimize, then you'll make even higher profits. Similarly, if its profit functions have to be decreasing in the price of inputs, if one input becomes cheaper, once again, the only thing is that you can earn more profits, even if you don't change your decisions. The critical thing is the profit function has to be convex in all the prices, output and input prices, right? And the last point is this Hotelling's lemma. The convexity of the profit function is what gives us positively sloped supply functions, as you'll see in a moment. Now, there's also Hotelling's lemma. Hotelling's lemma is very much like, Shepard's lemma and Roy's identity for this sort of problem. Basically, it links the value function of the problem, profit maximization problem, and its choice functions. And so essentially it says, if you know the profit function, and if you take the derivative of the profit function with respect to the output price, you get the supply function. If you take its derivative with respect to input price, you get the input demand function, right, with a negative sign. If you want to prove Hotelling's lemma, what mathematical trick do we have to utilize? Which theorem do we have to utilize?
Envelope theorem.
The envelope theorem, right? So it's a two-liner, really. So I'll leave that to you, right? Now, what about the convexity of the profit function? Can we prove the profit function is convex? Again, this is very similar to, if you remember, we proved that the expenditure function is concave in choice and consumer theory, right? By using the definition and using some inequalities. So the proof here is exactly identical. Again, I'll skip through it. I'll leave it to you to study. The logic is exactly along the same lines. And so if you have trouble understanding this, let me know. Okay, let's take it as given that the profit function is convex, and there's a rigorous proof to that effect. Now, in calculus terms, if our profit function is also differentiable, then convexity can be expressed as some property of derivatives of the function, in particular second derivatives, right? And what is the property? Again, we have discussed this before, so I'll be quick. The matrix of the second derivative of our convex profit function, namely this matrix or the Hessian matrix, has to be symmetric, positive, semi-definite, right? Earlier, we had concave expenditure functions, and then the matrix had to be negative, semi-definite. Here, because it's a convex function, it has to be positive, semi-definite. What that means is that the principal minors are all positive. None of them are negative. Now, this matrix of second derivative of the profit function is equivalent to this matrix of first derivatives of the supply and the input demand functions. All right. Where does it come from? How do I go from here to here and claim that this matrix is the same as this matrix?
Hotelling's lemma.
Hotelling's lemma.
Hotelling's lemma.
Hotelling's lemma.
Which we just listed. So you can see the structure of the logic is exactly like what you have seen, right? It's proceeding along the same lines. We prove concavity or convexity of one of our value functions. And then we ask, what does it mean in terms of derivatives? And we get a matrix. And that matrix, the elements of that matrix turn out to be slopes of our demand or supply functions. And that's how we reach conclusions about, what our demand and supply function ought to look like. So this matrix is positive semi-definite, which means all principal minors are positive. And as I discussed before, I'll not go painfully through every step because it's just sort of analogous. Every principal minor being positive means all the diagonal elements will have to be positive. That is easy to show, right? The first diagonal element is by definition the first principal minor. So there it's straightforward. You can also easily show that, the second diagonal element, the third diagonal element, all of them will have to be positive, right? And now if you look at the diagonal elements, what are they? The first diagonal element is del y del p. It's the slope of the supply function with respect to output price. So that's our usual slope of supply function, right? So this immediately nails the conclusion that supply curves are positively sloped. And all the input, so what are the other diagonal elements? They are slopes of the input demand functions with respect to own price, right? The slope of the ith input demand function with respect to the ith input price with a minus sign. So that means the own price slope of each input demand function is negative. So input demand functions are downward sloping, supply functions have positive slopes. That's the conclusion we reached. Okay, and that is a testable implication of this sort of simple classical theory of a competitive firm. Yes, that's a statement which can be contradicted by data, and we can check against market data with whether this is true or not. All right. Now, a couple of questions. In demand theory, when we tried to confirm the law of demand, that demand functions are downward sloping, we got an ambiguous answer, right? We couldn't reach the conclusion logically that demand functions have to be downward sloping. When we come to the theory of the firm, the supply side, there's no such ifs and buts. There's no ambiguity. Supply curves have to be positively sloped. Why this difference? Why do we say that demand curves
So
may or may
supply
not
curve,
be? Yeah. Go ahead.
so supply curve is always the upward portion of the increasing marginal cost. So in that we can't anyway take that to be downward sloping because then we can increase the supply. So increase the optimal output, and that's not our supply curve.
Because demand curve depends upon substitution and income effect.
Sure. Sure. To the first response, let me just say that, even if I take the kind of reasoning that you're providing, we have kept out increasing returns, right? Increasing returns doesn't go with perfect competition. So we are only looking at decreasing returns or constant returns. And for those kinds of technologies, marginal cost is non-decreasing for sure. Right? So what you're saying doesn't apply. Now, there's no income or substitution effects here. What does that tell us? I mean, I'm trying to, I want you to put your finger on a critical difference between the consumer's problem and the firm's problem.
Here we don't have budget constraint.
The consumer is maximizing whatever she's maximizing for a given budget. The firm doesn't have a budget constraint, right? Or
Yes, sir.
when we decompose the firm's problem into two steps, right? First step, cost minimization, construct the cost function. Second step, go on to profit maximization. Only the first step was similar to the consumer's problem. The second step was new. There's no equivalent to that second step in consumer theory, in the theory of demand, right? More succinctly put, consumers have a fixed budget, firms don't, right? So the firm's problem is a little more expansive, and that's why we get a clear-cut prediction over there. Now, let's think a little bit about that assumption. I didn't spell it out, and now I'm drawing your attention to it, that we are assuming that firms don't have a fixed budget. So if profit maximization requires them to buy, lakhs of crores of rupees worth of equipment, they will be able to do so. How will they be able to do so if they don't have that cash sitting on hand? They'll have to get loans, right? If there's a profitable business opportunity for an airline that they can maximize profit, but they have to buy 100 new aircraft or 1,000 new aircraft and rent a lot of space in a lot of airports, and that requires a lot of money and investment upfront. They don't have that money. So the implicit assumption in this sort of theory of the firm is that they can raise it from the market, either by selling new shares through equity or by borrowing, issuing corporate bonds, borrowing from banks, what have you. But financing is not a problem. That was our assumption, right? Now, is that true in the real world?
No, sir.
That's far from true if you think about it, okay? And there have been studies. So
Sir, because we don't know here it will be profitable or not.
Let me come to the cause just in a moment. Let me just sort of, again, very briefly tell you how we know that financing is a problem. There have been studies on MSMEs, right? Small firms in developing countries like India, Sri Lanka, and so on. How do they do these studies? They pick a sample of firms, right? The people doing the studies, and these are RCTs, randomized controlled trials. So they pick a number of firms, they divide them into a treatment group and a control group, right? So randomly selected, half of them are treatment groups. And they give some cash infusion to these treatment groups, right? So some firms in the study receive free cash to be used in the business, right? They can buy working capital, they can stock up their stores, what have you. And the control group is not given such cash infusion. And then they track the profits of these firms over the next several months or even years, right? And they try to measure by comparing the treatment group and the control group, what was the increase in profit due to the cash infusion for the firms who received that sort of cash, right? And from that, they can calculate what was the average return on investment, right? When some firms were given free extra capital. And they found that the return on investment, or the marginal product of extra capital, extra investment in these firms, is extremely high, right? They're of the order of 70, 80, 90%. Sometimes they're even greater than 100% in some of the studies, right? In Sri Lanka, there's a famous study by Asantha Di Meo and others, and they found returns of the range of 80%, 90%. Now, how do we know that this is a problem? Because banks are lending at much lower interest rates to other entities, right? They're giving home loans at 12%, they're giving credit card loans at 24%. And there are people out there, if you give them loans, they can generate 80, 90% out of rate of return. And the banks are not giving loans to those people. And those people are starved for such funds. That's why when they receive it as a windfall, their profits jump by that amount. So the credit market does not function well, and it's an understatement to say that, right? So one of the assumptions underlying this sort of analysis, namely that there is no credit constraint, there's no budget constraint for firms, is very, very questionable in the real world in many cases. Yes?
Yes, sir.
Okay, there's a little bit left, which I will do in the next lecture, which is that, so far, all of this analysis is assuming that there's a fixed number of firms in this market. That number is not going to increase, not going to decrease. Now, if you allow enough time, sometimes new firms can come in and existing firms can quit. And we are seeing that sort of churning all the time. As I said, our telecom market, right, has shrunk to 3 players from 8 or 10 players. And sometimes you have the reverse, right? Sometimes you have firms coming in and the number of players expanding. So as a last step, we may want to sort of extend our theory to allow for entry and exit. And one of the sort of, the way that sort of model is closed is saying that, well, entry will keep happening till profits fall to 0, right? So once you allow for entry or exit, you take exactly the analysis we have done and you add an extra condition, which is a 0 profit condition. And that 0 profit condition pins down N, the number of firms that will exist in the market. But that's the general idea. I'll flesh it out a little bit more by taking 15 minutes at the beginning of the next lecture to spell that out. Questions? There's a problem set. I've just covered the theory and I've been very quick. I've just spent 1 lecture because a lot of it is repetition, but you should practice a lot of these problems. There are plenty of problems in the problem set, past year papers. So walk through them so that you are well-versed in how to handle problems of involving, competitive firms and supply and cost functions and so on and so forth. Any questions? Okay, so just a reminder for people who came in a little late that I will have contact hours today at 4. So drop by in this Zoom room. And the other thing is that next Monday, I'm going to take a double lecture. So instead of ending at 3, I'll end at 4 with a short break in the middle so that I cover everything that I have to cover. All right, guys. Okay, so stop share.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Sir, I had a general question.